Sure. My name is Michael Wysession. I'm a professor of geophysics in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, where I am also the executive director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. I am the editor of Perspectives of Earth and Space Scientists at the American Geophysical Union. Certainly. So I grew up in the New York, New Jersey area, and actually growing up, my hero in high school was Walter Sullivan, who was the first science editor of the New York Times. And actually, I thought that I was going to be the next science editor of the New York Times. That was my my dream growing up. Life had different plans for me. I actually did one of the wonderful AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering fellowships when I was a graduate student, but I found that I'm too introverted to be a science journalist. I hated calling people on the telephone. So I stuck with the science, and that ended up being a good decision. I had wonderful teachers in the geology department at Brown University. In particular, my undergraduate mentor, seismologist Don Forsyth, who was just an amazing person, an amazing scientist, and had wonderful stories. And I think that was a real inspiration for me, and carries over into my role in the journal. I taught high school physics and math in New York City after undergraduate. And that also shaped my career in a variety of ways. I loved the teaching, but I have never worked so hard in my life as I did when I had 5 different classes 5 days a week. It was like doing 25 stand-up comedy routines trying to get 9th graders excited about algebra. And then I had a fabulous experience and a wonderful mentor in graduate school at Northwestern University. Emilio Call, the seismologist, was my mentor there, and just again showed me this variety of exciting ways to approach the science, and really looking at the science with an incredible sense of just joy and enjoyment. And that was very inspirational for me. And since then, for 30 years now, I've been a professor at Washington University in St. Louis.
Particular.
The new journal Perspectives is important for several reasons. It is critical for any community to retain its history. And certainly in the incredible breadth and depth of our journals, we do that to some extent. We have documented our science to an incredible degree. But there is a certain way that our other journals are written that intentionally precludes the personal side of the story. And when you're training your graduate students or trying to inspire your undergraduates, it is often those unwritten stories that are critically important. What are the struggles you faced? What are the realizations you came to? What were the turning points, the breaking points, the light bulbs that went off? How did you figure out how to collaborate with other people, to design experiments, to get funding? None of this goes into our journal, and it is critically important for the success of scientists to know this information. When I was a graduate student at Northwestern, we had a senior faculty member, Larry Sloss, one of the sort of founders of sedimentology and the history of sea level change. And he was emeritus at that point, but he came in every day into the coffee room and sat there and told stories. And the graduate students, we flocked to the room to hear these stories because they gave us a sense of our history, of our community. And that history, in his history, is written in the journals, but not the stories that he was telling in that coffee room. And it is one of the most important things when we get together at AGU conferences and sit around over a meal or a beer or something. There is talk of science, to be sure, but there's also talk of those stories, of our history, of who got started and who worked and who was really good to work with and who wasn't, and what were the rivalries or the exciting partnerships, or sometimes simply practically, like, how do you get the work done? How do you get the funding? How do you get the materials? How do you get the students? And and there needs to be a place within any scientific endeavor where those stories are passed down. This concept of stories actually is very timely. You can see the success of things like the NPR Story Corps, capturing people's stories. But it is critically important for science as well. And in fact, I had the real honor to be one of the lead organizers and co-authors of the Next Generation Science Standards, which we began work at the National Academy of Science in creating first a framework of how students should learn science in the United States. And then we went on and actually wrote the standards that have now been adopted by 45 states and Washington, D.C. in a variety of different ways. And fundamental to this new way of teaching science is something called phenomenon-based learning. And it involves capturing the student's attention with some phenomenon, some idea around, or essential question around which you build a storyline. And this takes advantage of simply how we're hardwired, right? I mean, go back 1,000, 2,000 years ago, we're sitting around caves somewhere, and we're, or maybe 10,000 years ago, whatever, and we're telling stories. And our early history was passed down through this oral tradition of storytelling for thousands of years before anything was ever written down. And it is inherent to how we learn. We are hardwired. Our neural pathways are function really well learning material through stories. Whether it's your uncle telling of the stories of your favorite baseball team 40 years ago, or your family history, or your cultural history, or religious history, or your national history. We gravitate towards storylines. It's just a very effective way to learn. So we have now instilled throughout the nation, K-12, this development of intriguing storylines around which students understand not only the content of science, but the practices of science and the cross-cutting concepts of science. And so for us at the American Geophysical Union, for our community, we needed an opportunity to have our stories told. And there's a trick here, because the stories are not only entertaining, which of course has value in of itself, but they pull the reader in and provide a powerful mechanism for learning. So when you read some of the articles that have been published so far through Perspectives, they have humor, they have humility, they talk about failures, they talk about successes, sort of sometimes the arcs of a scientist's life. They draw you into that story, but in the process, you're learning how these scientific fields evolved, or how sort of great minds identify problems that are important, or how they meet and overcome obstacles. And those lessons will be critical to our young scientists as they go forward. And, not everyone has the luxury of having a Larry Sloss in their department coffee room to tell the history of the early decades of the field. And so to have this sort of record of our stories, just the way NPR has this record of these Story Corps episodes, For us, it's specific to our field of geophysics, but it is I think, a critically important step in the evolution of any large organization, and overdue for the AGU to have this record available to our community. Personally, Perspectives is very special to me for a couple of reasons. This is actually the 5th AGU journal that I have been an editor for. Most recently, I was an editor for 5 years of GRL. I really enjoy being an editor, working with text, working with the science. And for Perspectives, and part of the reason is I learned so much. You know, my work as an editor of JGR or GRL or AOS has given me an understanding of the field in ways that never would have happened if I had not been an editor. And by the way, I strongly recommend editing journals to anyone in the community who's ever wondered whether or not they might want to do it. It is a remarkable way to learn at a higher level. With Perspectives, I'm learning in a new way. I'm learning the stories of sort of people in our field who've made tremendous contributions, and seeing what they went through, how the science evolved, how programs developed. And I am riveted by the stories that I read. I find them remarkably enjoyable. Now, you could say, you could do this without being an editor. You could just read everything that's published. Honestly, in our lives, in my life, there are so many things constantly that are in crisis mode, or deadlines that I have to deal with yesterday or today. And having this opportunity sort of put upon me in terms of a responsibility is almost like carving out time for fun for me, because reading these articles really is fun, and I make sure that I provide some time in my day for something that's very enjoyable. When we started Perspectives, there were challenges, as there are with the start of any journal. Developing an editorial board, developing a set of guidelines to really understand what it is we're looking for, particularly in the case of Perspectives, which is a very different format from other journals. And then, of course, there are the challenges of recognition, getting our community to know that this is available. However, the single largest obstacle in the case of Perspectives has been the steeped history of sexism, racism, and classism that exists within modern science. And the way this plays out is we really want to make sure we have a diversity of voices in our journal. And the first place we looked was our College of Fellows, the people who have been recognized for reaching levels of great contributions within our field. However, if you look at that College of Fellows, it's almost entirely white males. And that is because for most of the history of science, science has been the privilege of the white wealthy male. And it's been a challenge to make sure that our perspectives represent the diversity of voices that we now have as part of our membership. And if you look at young scientists today, you see we've made tremendous gains in diversifying the community of scientists. But that diversity is not replicated in our senior scientists because of the significant changes happened just over my lifetime. So that will remain a challenge for Perspectives because we do want have the bulk of our stories be those slightly more senior voices that have the perspective of looking back over their careers and being able to use that perspective in order to tell sort of rich stories that have impact and meaning to the next generation of scientists. But we need to also make sure that these stories and these voices can resonate across the full diversity of our membership, and that's something that we will continue to work very hard to do. For perspectives, there are several important key components that make for a good article, that make for a valuable contribution to the journal. Fundamental to this is a sense of humility. I think the articles that we have seen that have made the greatest impact, or that are the most appealing, are those where scientists can look back across their career or particular events with a sense of humbleness and humility towards the tremendous challenges that they have faced. We are all, just by being part of AGU, accomplished scientists all in our own ways. And the people who we've had particularly write many of the early stories are even more recognized for their accomplishments. But we definitely do not want these articles to read like CVs of people's accomplishments. CVs are available on websites for scientists. That does not provide an added value. What we want to see is people's humanity in how they deal with their science. And another part of that is critically important is humor. Humor is something that we tend to discourage in other articles. When you read a science article in most any journal, there has been an attempt to sort of suppress personality from coming through. It does sometimes in journal articles. We've all seen it, and it can be quite enjoyable when it does. This is an opportunity for people's personalities to come out, and that's really exciting. You read a perspectives article, you learn something about the science. You also learn something about the personality of the person writing it. And humor is just a very powerful mechanism of communication. I'm not talking about slapstick or corny or anything like that. There is, in humor, as with anything else, a very fine line. But humor in an appropriate manner can be a powerful tool for communicating with the reader. And some of the articles I've enjoyed most have the joy of sort of looking at their own lives and successes and failures with a sense of humor that is very engaging. I see down the road 10 years, perspectives playing a really important role for AGU. And I hope it gets recognized across all of the multiple diverse divisions of AGU. We are at a critical point where we are old enough that many of the scientists who were working at those formative years, the obvious example is plate tectonics in the 1960s, where many of those scientists are no longer with us. And those stories, some of them are still passed down as part of our oral tradition. But I think it's really critical that we understand where we came from, how we began. And I see perspectives playing a valuable role in capturing the history of our many fields. I also really hope and expect that in 10 years that this is a journal that will be read by our young scientists, that they will look at this as part of their education. They've got to learn the tools, the math and the physics and the chemistry and the biology and all of this. That's critical for them to be able to do their research. But it's, in a mathematical term, it's necessary but insufficient. And I think knowing the history of how the science has evolved, I'm hoping that our young scientists will see this as a critical part of their own education. I think Perspectives has an enormous amount to teach to early researchers in so many different ways. As you read through some of the different Perspectives articles, you get a sense of how many different ways there are to do good science. And this is really important because we each grow up in our own bubble. We may have a handful of mentors as undergrads and a handful of mentors as graduate students. We may see inevitably science through a few lenses then. And what Perspectives can do is show you the incredible range of experiences that can occur in sciences. So many scientists, work with data. Some never work with data. Some sit behind a computer and do clever modeling. Some sit with a pencil and a notebook and work from first principles. Some work alone, some work as part of massive teams collaborating, which is much more common than working alone. There are so many different styles and ways to do science. And we need to, for the health of our own science, have some understanding of what this range is, both in solving a particular problem or an obstacle. So you may come upon something in your work as a young scientist, and it may seem an insurmountable barrier to you. But if you know the history of how people have dealt with insurmountable barriers, you're better armed to find a way around them. But it's also important in taking people who are already marching ahead and whose path might be smooth, but to show them the places that they can go, the places that are available, to help them to think and dream big, and because of course the reality is we don't hit home runs all the time. Most of our science, they're singles or bunts or sacrifice flies or whatever. And that's okay. Much of the science marches along sort of, in your own personal career and as a whole, incrementally, slowly. It's a slow moving wave that proceeds. But you also don't want to be so focused on those small, short gains that you miss the opportunity for the big score when it happens. And the people who write some of these Perspectives articles are people who've had the opportunity to hit that home run. And so, awareness, mindfulness is 90% of the game. If you read these stories, you have a sense of the kind of mindset that you need in order to be aware of those opportunities when they come up, those opportunities to make a dramatic, important discovery. Maybe you won't invent or plate tectonics. Only a couple people got to do that, and that happened a long time ago. But there are constantly whole new discoveries that are really reshaping the way we think about Earth and space science. And I think knowing those stories will help the next generation of young researchers make those exciting discoveries in the future.